In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, where the San Juan Basin spreads out flat and pale under a sky that holds almost no moisture, a shallow rift runs east to west for about 10 miles, and this rift is Chaco Canyon. The floor lies near 6,000 feet above the distant sea, and the walls of cliff house sandstone rise on either side to something near 100 feet, banded in cream and rust where the weather has worked at them across the long centuries. The land here is dry in a way that orders everything within it, taking in only 9 inches or so of rain across an entire year. And what falls comes in 2 seasons, the slow snows of a cold winter and the brief, heavy storms of late summer that build over the basin in the afternoons and break and pass and leave the ground steaming. Between those seasons, the canyon is held in a long aridity, the air so clear that the far rim seems nearer than it is, the light falling hard on the stone in the morning and softening to gold along the cliffs as the day ends. Pinon and juniper hold to the higher ground of the mesa tops, low and dark and spaced wide apart where the thin soil allows them. And on the canyon floor, the vegetation grows lower still, greasewood and saltbush and the gray-green brush that endures on little water. Down the middle of the floor runs the Chaco Wash, a watercourse that carries nothing for most of the year, its bed dry and seamed, and then runs full and brown for a few days after the snowmelt and after the heaviest of the summer storms before it sinks again into stillness. The growing season is short at this elevation, fitted into the months between the last hard frost of the spring and the first of the autumn, and the cold settles into the canyon at night, even in the warm months, draining down off the mesas and pooling on the floor by morning. The basin around the canyon is enormous and nearly level, a high tableland of sage and stone that runs for many miles in every direction, broken only by the dark line of the Chusca Mountains far off along the western horizon, by isolated mesas standing out blue with distance, and by the wide, shallow drainages that gather what little water the land receives and carry it, when it moves at all, slowly northward toward the San Juan River. At the eastern end, near the mouth of the canyon, a single sandstone tower stands apart from the cliffs, isolated on the open ground, its sides steep and its flat top set hard against the sky. And this is Fajada Butte, the most visible landmark in a country that otherwise runs to low horizons and great emptiness. The canyon itself is not deep nor grand in the way of the great gorges of the region, only a long, shallow trough worn into the tableland, and a traveler coming across the basin would not see it until close upon its rim, the floor opening below with its pale wash and its dark line of brush. It is a severe place, and a quiet one, the kind of country that gives little and asks much, where the water must be gathered and held, and the warmth kept, and the year watched closely. And yet for 3 centuries this shallow canyon was the gathering center of a world that reached far beyond its walls, out across the whole of the basin, and on toward the mountains and the rivers and the warm lands far to the south. The rock of the walls was laid down long before, the cliff house sandstone, the remnant of an ancient shoreline turned to stone, and the canyon was cut into it slowly by the wash and the weather, a shallow trough rather than a true gorge, with the broad Chakra Mesa rising to the south and the open mesa country falling away to the north. Other washes feed the basin around it, the Escavada coming in from the north and the Gallo cutting down from the side, and all of them carry water only in their seasons and lie dry and pale between. The soil on the floor is fine and wind-laid in places, gathered into low dunes along the southern side where the maize could be planted in the deeper sand that held the moisture, and elsewhere it is thin over the bedrock and quick to shed its water. The whole of this country was the northern reach of a wide ancestral Puebloan world that spread across the high tableland where the 4 great regions of the modern map now meet, a world of dry farmers living in stone and earth, and the canyon lay near the heart of it, neither the highest ground nor the lowest, neither the wettest nor the most barren, but a place set so that the lines of sight and the courses of travel converged upon it. The margin of life here was always narrow, the rain a few inches either way deciding the harvest, the frost a few weeks early or late deciding the year. And the people who settled the canyon read that margin closely and built their whole order around the holding of water and warmth against a land that gave neither freely. The silence of the canyon is one of its deepest qualities, for there is little here to make a sound, no falling water and no movement of crowds, only the wind moving through the brush and over the rock, the call of a raven crossing the open air, the small sounds of the dry land, and that silence lay over the place in the years of its building as it lies over it now. The color of the country turns slowly with the seasons, the pale gold of the dry grass, the gray-green of the sage and the saltbush, the dark of the pinon on the heights, the deep rust and cream of the sandstone shifting hour by hour as the sun crosses it. And after the rare rain, the whole basin briefly greens before the dryness takes it back. The walls of the canyon hold the light in a way that orders the days, the eastern faces catching the first of the morning while the western lies still in shadow, the low winter sun reaching far back along the cliff, and the high summer sun standing nearly overhead at noon, so that the building of the great houses against the northern wall was a building into the path of that light. The shape of that reach is held now in the ground and in the stone along the canyon's northern wall, where the light moves across the banded courses through the long course of the day, and the pattern of it is still legible to anyone who walks the floor and reads what stands there. Along the base of the north cliff, where the sandstone wall gives shelter from the worst of the cold and turns the low winter sun back into the open ground, stand the great houses, and they are unlike anything else built on the floor of the canyon. They are masonry buildings of many rooms and several stories, planned as wholes and raised in deliberate stages across generations, and the largest of them, Pueblo Bonito, holds more than 600 rooms within a single great D-shaped mass, its straight south wall closing off a pair of plazas, and its curved rear wall rising at the back to 4 and in places 5 stories. The walls that carry this height are built in a manner the Chacoan masons refined across the long generations of building, a hidden core of rubble and mortar faced on both sides with sandstone laid in careful courses, the technique now called core and veneer, and the finest of the facing is banded, broad flat stones alternating with bands of small thin tablets set in tight even rows, a surface that was often covered afterward beneath a coat of mud plaster, and yet was laid with great precision all the same. Those who study the masonry have sorted it into a sequence of styles laid down across the centuries, the earliest courses simpler and the later ones more refined and more banded, so that the wall itself records the order of its own building. The stone for all of it came from the cliffs above, quarried from the cliff house sandstone in tablets and slabs and dressed by patient abrasion against harder stone, shaped without metal of any kind, and the mortar was mud carried up from the wash and the side drainages. The roofs were carried on heavy primary beams of ponderosa pine and fir, set across the walls and crossed in turn by smaller secondary poles. And over the poles came a layer of split shakes or matting, and then a packing of earth, so that each finished roof became the floor of the room above, and the buildings grew upward in tiers, stepped back from the plaza like a slope of stone against the cliff. Movement through them was not along streets but through the rooms themselves, by way of doorways cut in the thick walls, many of them shaped in the distinctive form the Chacoans favored, broad at the shoulder and narrowed below into the outline of a T, and by way of hatches in the roofs reached by ladders, so that the great house was entered and crossed as an interior, room giving on to room, level giving on to level, the inner rooms windowless and dim and cool. Set down into the room blocks and out into the enclosed plazas are the kivas, round chambers sunk below the floor, walled in the same fine masonry, roofed over flush with the ground and entered from above, each with its bench running around the wall, its ventilator shaft bringing air to the hearth, a low deflector slab before the fire, and a small pit set in the floor beyond. And at intervals among them are the great kivas, far larger circular rooms dug deep into the earth, and floored and benched and roofed across great spans on 4 massive posts seated in masonry footings, the largest enclosed spaces in the whole of the canyon, anchoring the open ground the way the great houses anchor the cliff. There were a dozen or more of these great houses along the canyon and on the mesa above it, Chaco close beside Pueblo Bonito, with its own long rear wall and its high raised plaza, Pueblo del Arroyo standing out nearer the wash, Una Vida and Jungo Pavi and Quincletzo and Pueblo Alto up on the mesa top, and the others ranged along the cliff, each one distinct in its plan, and yet each built to the same grammar of banded stone and stepped rooms and sunken round chambers. The building of them was a planned thing, and not a slow accretion of single rooms. For the foundations of whole wings were laid out at once, and the walls raised in great blocks of rooms together. The lower walls built thick and broad from the start to carry the stories that came after, so that the masons worked to an intention held in mind across many years and more than one generation of builders. The rooms of the great houses are larger than those of the ordinary dwellings, and their ceilings higher, the masonry finer, the beams more massive, and many of the inner rooms have no hearth and show little sign of the daily living that fills an ordinary house, which has led those who study them to see the great houses as something other than simple dwellings, places of storage and gathering and ceremony as much as of habitation. Some of the houses raised tower kivas, round chambers built up above the ground rather than sunk into it, and the later buildings such as Quincletzo and Quincletzin and Wijiji were raised in a more compact blocky style, their stone shaped to a different measure, the work of the canyon's last generations of building. Up on the high mesa to the north stood Pueblo Alto, set where the roads gathered and where the line of sight ran far across the basin, and around the great houses ran low, enclosing walls that closed off the plazas and bounded the ground, so that each house was a whole and ordered thing set against the cliff. The interior surfaces of many of the rooms were finished with care, the masonry coated in mud plaster, and in places washed white or painted with bands of color and simple designs along the base of the walls, so that the rooms which now stand bare to the rough stone were once smooth and colored and closed, dim and cool and ordered within. The doorways themselves were worked with intention, some shaped in the T-form, some set with a raised stone sill to be stepped over, some placed in the corners of rooms where the line of sight ran toward the rising or the setting of the sun at the turning of the year, and many were carefully sealed with masonry when the rooms behind them were closed and given over to storage or set apart. The contrast between the great houses and the small houses across the wash was a contrast of scale and of finish and of intent. The unit pueblos low and plain and clearly lived in, their few rooms worn with the marks of daily living, while the great houses rose high and fine and largely empty of the ordinary signs of habitation, built to a measure and a precision that the simple dwelling did not require. Two kinds of building set across one narrow canyon floor and speaking to two different purposes. A person moving among them in the years of their use would have read the same intention written again and again along the base of the northern wall. The same care in the laying of the stone, the same massing of rooms about the open plazas, the same round chambers set into the ground, a single architectural language spoken in building after building for 300 years. In the cold hour after first light, the smoke of the cook fires settles low along the canyon floor, drawn down by the night air and slow to lift, and it hangs in pale layers between the room blocks until the sun clears the south rim and begins to move it. The grinding begins early, at the metats set in their bins along the walls, flat troughs of stone worn into the surface by years of use, where the dried maize is broken first on the coarse stone and then carried to the finer stone and worked down to meal. The sound of it steady and low and repeated from house to house along the cliff. The grinding was the long labor of the morning, for the meal of a large household took many hours of it. The women kneeling to the stone and rocking the handstone forward and back, and the grit of the sandstone went into the meal and into the bread, and wore at the teeth of the people in a way the bones still show. Water was fetched in the early cold, carried up from the wash where it stood in pools after a rain, and from the basins and seeps below the cliffs where the runoff gathered and held, and it was brought back in jars to the hearths where the meal was mixed and the thin bread cooked on heated slabs of stone laid over the fire. Most of the people of the canyon did not live in the great houses at all, but across the wash and along the side drainages, in the small house sites, the unit pueblos of a handful of rooms gathered around a single small kiva, and it was from these ordinary dwellings that the households moved out in the morning to the work of the day. The fields lay on the canyon floor where the runoff could be led to them, and up the side canyons where the water came down off the slick rock, and the work of them filled the growing season, the breaking of the ground, the setting of the seed deep to reach the buried moisture, the weeding and the long watching of the sky for the rain that might come or might hold off. Within the room blocks the turkeys were kept in pens, birds raised first for their feathers, which were cut and twisted around cord and worked into warm blankets for the cold nights, and used in time for their meat as well, and the pens and the birds and the daily sweeping of the rooms all fed the middens. Those middens grew on the south-facing slopes below the houses, great mounds of ash and broken pottery and maize cobs, and the bones of turkey and deer and rabbit, and the small refuse of generations, layered season on season so that they hold now, read carefully by those who dig them slowly, the long record of what the canyon ate and made and discarded. Beside the maize, the people grew beans and squash in the same plots, the old planting of the dry country, and gathered from the land around the piñon nuts in the years the trees bore them, the seeds of wild plants, the fruit of the cactus, and they hunted the deer on the mesas and snared the rabbits on the flats and brought the meat back to the canyon to be shared and dried. The food of the morning and of the day was above all maize, ground and boiled and baked into the thin bread cooked on the hot stone, eaten with beans and with squash in their season, and with the dried meat of the deer and the rabbit and the turkey. And the bones of the people carry the record of that diet, the wear of the gritty meal upon the teeth, the marks of the hard seasons in the growth of the young, the toll of a life lived close to the margin in a dry land. The labor was divided along the old lines, the grinding and the cooking and the carrying of water, and much of the making of pots and baskets, the work of the women, the hunting and the clearing and the heavier building the work of the men, and the children set early to the carrying and the watching and the small tasks, while the dogs that lived among the houses kept at the edges of it all. Within the cool, dim rooms, the work of the hands went on through the warm hours, the coiling and scraping and painting of pots, the chipping of stone tools from the cores carried in, the twisting of cord and the weaving of cloth, and the smell of the cook smoke and the ground maize and the penned birds hung over the whole of the canyon floor. The making of the pottery filled some of the mornings as well. The clay gathered and cleaned and tempered and built up into vessels by the coiling of long ropes of clay, smoothed into walls. The surfaces slipped and painted with the yucca brush, and then fired in the open in beds of fuel that had to be gathered across the dry country. And the corrugated cooking jars left with their coils pinched and unsmoothed to take the heat. Baskets were woven from the gathered fibers, tight enough in some cases to hold water, and the digging sticks were shaped for the planting, and the sandals were twined from the yucca to be worn through and made again. And all of this work of the hands went on in the cool of the rooms and the shade of the walls through the warming hours of the morning. In the first cold light, the breath of the people and the animals showed in the air, and the frost lay on the stone until the sun reached it, and the rooms gave up their night chill slowly, so that the early work was done in the cold and the later work in the gathering warmth, the day climbing from the frost of dawn toward the heat of the afternoon. The morning was the time of grinding and hauling and going out, the time when the canyon was most fully in motion, when the children carried water and the old worked the stone within the cool rooms, and the able went out to the fields and the hunt, and the smoke of the fires thinned at last into the clearing sky, and the day's heat began to gather against the pale northern wall. And the long ordinary labor of feeding the canyon went on as it had gone on for many lifetimes. Of all that the canyon was built from and worked with, the most ordinary material was the one closest to hand, the cliff house sandstone of the walls themselves, quarried in tablets and slabs from the cliffs and the mesa edges, and dressed by grinding. And it was from this that every great house and every kiva was raised, course on course, across 3 centuries. But the timber that roofed them was not of the canyon, for the canyon and the basin around it carried no forests of the kind the building required, only the low scattered pinyon and juniper, and the great primary beams, the ponderosa and the fir and the spruce, came from far away. The study of their growth rings and of the chemistry held in the wood has traced the sources with care, and the beams came down from the Chusca Mountains more than 50 miles to the west, and from the San Mateo Highlands and the Zuni Mountains to the south, cut and trimmed and seasoned in the uplands, and carried across the dry basin on foot, without cart or draft animal or the help of the wheel. Something near 200,000 trees brought in across the lifetime of the building, each beam carried by people across many days of open country. The pottery of the canyon was for the most part black on white, the pale slipped surface painted in mineral and carbon pigments with fine hatched lines and banded geometric designs worked with a yucca brush, and beside it stood the plain culinary wares, the corrugated jars whose coils were left unsmoothed and pinched to take the heat of the cook fire, and much of the painted ware was not made in the canyon at all, but carried in from the better timbered uplands, where the clay and the fuel for firing were more easily had. The clays and the tempers have been traced, as the timber has, and they point outward to the same uplands, so that even the vessels at the hearth were in large part things brought into the canyon from beyond its rim. Turquoise ran through everything, worked in the canyon in great quantity, drilled and ground and polished into beads by the many tens of thousands, into pendants and small mosaic pieces of inlay, the raw stone drawn from sources scattered across the wider region, among them the Cerrillos Hills away to the east, near where Santa Fe now stands, and the finished work gathered in the great houses in a concentration found at no other place in the whole Puebloan world. Cotton was brought in and spun on the weighted spindle and woven on the loom. Chert and obsidian were carried in for the making of blades and projectile points, the obsidian traceable by its chemistry to particular volcanic flows far to the south and west, and marine shell came up from the Gulf of California, hundreds of miles distant, to be cut and ground and strung into ornament beside the turquoise. Even the salt and the pigments and the fine basketry came along the same channels from the same wide hinterland. The working of the turquoise was a craft pursued in the canyon on a scale found nowhere else, and the floors of certain rooms in Pueblo Bonito and in the small houses across the wash were thick with the debris of it, the tiny chips and the broken drills and the unfinished beads, the leavings of a labor that turned the rough stone into the finished ornament by the tens of thousands of pieces. Beside the turquoise, the makers worked jet into black ornaments and shaped pendants of polished shell, and set small mosaics of stone and shell upon backings of wood and bone, and ground the red and yellow earths into the pigments that colored the body and the painted pot and the kiva wall. Much of the finest stone for the blades and the points was a banded chert, quarried from the Chusca Mountains far to the west, the same uplands that gave the timber, carried in across the basin with the beams, and the obsidian came from flows farther still, each piece a sign of the distance the canyon reached to furnish itself. The great labor among all of it was the timber, for to bring near 200,000 trees across 50 miles and more of open country on foot, each beam cut to length and trimmed and seasoned, and then carried by people without animal or wheel, was a work of a magnitude difficult to set against anything else in the building. A steady drawing in of the forests of distant mountains to roof the rooms of a canyon that had no forest of its own. The scale of the building, measured in the labor it required, is among the things the study of the canyon has tried to reckon. The quarrying and dressing of the stone, the gathering of the mud for the mortar and the plaster, the cutting and carrying of the timber, the raising of the walls course on course, all of it the work of human hands across generations, and the reckoning runs to many hundreds of thousands of days of labor gathered into the great houses of one small canyon. The finest of the masonry, the banded veneer laid with such care, was in many places covered over afterward with the mud plaster, so that the precision of the stonework was not always meant to be seen, but was laid true all the same, a care taken in the hidden fabric of the wall, and this has told those who study it much about the intention behind the building. The smaller tools and goods of the canyon were drawn from the same wide country. The bone awls and needles worked from the deer and the turkey, the digging sticks and the wooden implements, the hammerstones and the grinding stones, the red and yellow earths ground for paint, the fibers gathered and spun, each made from what the land and the trade together provided. So the canyon was a place that drew materials toward itself across great distance, the stone alone from its own walls and almost everything else from beyond the rim, the timber and the painted pots and the turquoise and the obsidian and the shell and the cotton, all converging on the floor of a dry canyon that produced little of its own, but maize and the labor of building and the ordering of all the rest. And the carrying itself, the long patient movement of heavy and precious things across the empty basin on the backs of people, was among the largest of the works the canyon accomplished. Out from the canyon, across the mesa tops and over the open basin, runs a system of roads, and these are not the worn paths of ordinary travel, but constructed ways, cleared of stone and brush to a width far greater than a footpath needs, near 30 feet across in places, edged here and there with low berms or lines of set rock, and graded to hold a course that is remarkably straight across long distances. Where such a road meets the cliff, it does not turn aside to find an easy grade, but climbs the rock directly by stairways cut into the sandstone and built up with masonry, holding its line over the edge and on across the mesa beyond. And one such stair, the great cut stairway behind Chetro Kettle, climbs the north cliff in broad steps worn into the living rock. The roads link the canyon to the outlying great houses scattered across the San Juan Basin, scores of them set at distances near and far, sharing the canyon's banded masonry and its stepped rooms and its sunken kivas, some of them more than 50 miles off, so that the pattern raised along the northern wall of Chaco repeats in smaller compass across a territory many days wide, from salmon and the Aztec houses in the north to outliers far to the south and west. On the heights between them stood points of line of sight, places set on the high ground from which a signal of fire by night or smoke by day could carry from one rise to the next and on toward the canyon, binding the far houses to the center across ground that a person would cross only slowly on foot across many days. Into the canyon along these channels came the turquoise and the timber and the painted pottery and the maize of a wide hinterland, gathered inward toward the great houses, and out of it, in some measure, came the ordering and the ceremony and the gathering that drew the basin toward its center. And the reach did not end at the edge of the basin, for the canyon was tied, faintly but unmistakably, to the great civilizations far to the south in Mesoamerica, across 1,000 miles of intervening country. Copper bells, small and finely cast by pouring molten metal into a mold formed around a model of wax, a craft not practiced anywhere in the north, have been recovered in the canyon, carried up the long way from the metalworking lands of the south. In the great houses were kept scarlet macaws, brilliant crimson and blue birds of the tropical lowlands, whose nearest breeding range lay hundreds of miles to the south, carried north alive across that whole distance and held and valued, and, by the evidence of their bones, sometimes bred in the canyon itself. And in the long rear rooms of Pueblo Bonito were found cylinder jars, tall straight-sided painted vessels of a form known almost nowhere else in the whole region, and the residue dried into their walls has been identified by careful chemistry as cacao, the chocolate of the far south, another thing carried up the long way from the tropics to be drunk from vessels made in the canyon for the purpose. The outlying great houses ranged across an enormous territory, from Chimney Rock set high on its narrow ridge far to the north, where the moon rose between its twin rock pinnacles at the limit of its long cycle, to Salmon and the Aztec houses on the San Juan and the Animas, to Lowry away to the northwest, and a great many more scattered south and west across the basin and beyond, each tied to the canyon by the shared masonry and by the roads and the lines of sight. One road in particular, the Great Way running north from the canyon, holds its straight course for many miles across the open country toward the Badlands at Cut's Canyon, passing the small house and shrine at Twin Angels, a road that leads to no large settlement at its end, and seems to have been built as much for the holding of a line across the land as for the carrying of goods along it. The macaws in the great houses were brought from the tropical south as live birds across that whole vast distance, and the bones of the very young among them show that some were hatched and reared in the canyon itself, a keeping of tropical birds in a cold, high desert that speaks of how far the reach extended and how much was carried along it. The copper bells, several dozen of them recovered across the canyon, and the cylinder jars of Pueblo Bonito numbering near 200, a form found in such number nowhere else, together with the cacao dried in their walls, mark the thin, steady thread that bound this northern center to the great cultures of Mesoamerica 1,000 miles away. Though the canyon kept always its own character and its own building, and was never a colony of the South, but a place that drew upon it from afar. How exactly the goods moved along the roads and the lines of sight is read carefully from what was left, whether by the steady passing of things from hand to hand and house to house across the basin, or by the direct carrying of goods to the canyon from far off, and the gatherings that drew people inward, the seasons when the far communities came to the center for ceremony and for exchange, seem to have been part of how the canyon held its wide world together. At certain of the great houses, the leavings speak of great gatherings and great consumption, the mounds of broken vessels, and the bones of many deer and many turkeys, the remains of feasts that drew people from across the basin to the center at the turning times of the year, and the very form of the canyon, with its great kivas and its enclosed plazas, was made to hold such gatherings. The breaking and the deliberate placing of pottery and of other things at the ends of roads and in the fabric of the buildings, the careful closing of rooms, the offerings set into the walls, all suggest that the moving of goods and the gathering of people were bound up with ceremony, that the trade and the road and the rite were not separate things but one fabric drawn inward toward the canyon. So the trade that fed Chaco reached at its nearest to the side canyons and the mesa fields, and at its farthest into a world entirely unlike the dry basin in which the canyon lay. A warm green world of metal and bright birds and cacao 1,000 miles away, and the thin threads of that long reach gathered, with everything else, on the floor of the canyon along the foot of the northern cliff. As the light goes out of the canyon, and the sun drops below the western rim, the pale northern wall holds the heat of the day for a time and gives it slowly back into the cooling air, and the work that filled the morning turns inward and quiet. The grinding that began at dawn continues now by firelight in some of the rooms, for the meal of a large household is not made in a single morning, and around the hearths the evening tasks gather, the stringing of the drilled turquoise beads onto cord, the shaping and polishing of awls and needles from the bone of deer and turkey, the chipping of stone, the mending of nets, and the twining of yucca fiber into cordage, and into the woven sandals that the dry rock wore through quickly. The light of the fires moves on the plastered walls and on the low ceilings, and the smoke draws up through the roof hatches into the dark, and the smell of it, and of the cooking, and of the close-kept rooms is the smell of the canyon at evening. The great houses are quiet in their upper tiers as the dark comes on, for many of those high inner rooms held not sleeping households, but stored maize and stored goods, sealed and dim, the buildings serving as much for the keeping of things as for the dwelling of people. And the life of the evening drew down into the lower rooms and into the round chambers near the plazas. The warmth gathered in the kivas, those sunken rooms entered by ladder down through a hatch in the roof, with the bench running round the wall and the ventilator drawing a thin, cold thread of fresh air down to feed the hearth and the deflector turning the draught aside from the flame, and the small pit set in the floor beyond the fire. And there in the close, warm dark below the level of the ground, the talk and the handwork and the quiet ceremony of the night went on. Across the wash the small houses settled into the same rhythm at the same hour, the same fires banked low against the coming cold, the same beads and cord and bone worked by the same low firelight, the unit pueblos quiet around their single kivas, so that the evening of the canyon was lived twice over, grandly along the cliff in the great houses and plainly across the water in the small ones, to the same slow measure and the same early dark. Above it all the sky came on, and in air this dry and this far from any other fire or light, the stars stood out in a depth and number rarely seen, the long band of the galaxy laid clear across the dark from rim to rim, the same sky against which the great houses had been set and squared by the masons who raised them. The evening was also the time of the gathering of households, when the food cooked through the day was shared among the people of a room block and the kin who lived close together, the maize and the beans, and what meat the hunt had brought set out and divided, and the old accounts of the people, and the knowledge of the year, and the planting and the sky passed from the old to the young in the warm dark, not as anything written, but as the steady handing down that such a life depends upon. The blankets of twisted turkey feather and of woven cotton and of rabbit fur held the warmth against the bodies as the fires burned low, and the woven sandals were set aside and the tools laid by, and the round kivas with their close warm air and their single ladder rising to the dark hatch held the men through the long evenings at their work and their talk below the level of the cold ground. The pottery vessels stood ranged along the walls and in the corners, the great storage jars and the cooking pots and the painted bowls, the wealth of an ordinary household measured in part by the work of clay it kept. And the firelight moved over them and over the grinding bins and the hanging cordage as the night went on. The smell of the burning juniper and piñon hung over the canyon through the evening, the resinous smoke of the desert wood that was gathered and dried and burned for warmth and for cooking, and it settled into the rooms and the cloth and the hair of the people, and rose in thin columns from the roof hatches into the cooling air above the cliff. As the dark deepened, the cold came down quickly off the open ground, and the shadows of the cliff and the buildings ran long and then merged into the general dark, and the only light along the whole floor of the canyon was the glow of the fires through the doorways and the hatches, small and scattered and warm against the great surrounding night. The constellations rose in their seasons over the southern rim and crossed the sky through the long hours, the same patterns the people had watched across their lives and their forebears across theirs. The wheeling of the stars, a clock and a calendar to those who knew them. And in the deep clarity of that desert air, the faintest of them stood out plainly, the whole dome of the sky alive with them from rim to rim. The nights in this country are long through much of the year, and they are cold, colder than the warm, dry days would suggest, the heat draining off the open ground as soon as the sun is gone. And the buildings were made to meet that cold, the thick masonry walls and the deep sunken rooms, holding what warmth the fires and the day had given them, so that the people of the canyon passed the long, dark hours close to the banked fires, below the heavy earthen roofs and the packed floors above, while the frost gathered on the stone outside, and the stars wheeled slowly over the southern rim, until the cold hour before the dawn brought the grinding and the hauling and the going out once more. The great kivas are the largest enclosed spaces the canyon holds, and they were made for gathering rather than for dwelling, dug deep into the ground and ringed with benches and roofed across great spans on heavy posts set in masonry footings sunk below the floor. Casa Rinconada stands apart from the great houses on the south side of the wash, alone on a low rise facing the cliff, and the houses across the way, more than 60 feet across within its circular wall, with a raised firebox at the center, a pair of great rectangular masonry vaults set into the floor on either side of it, a low bench running the full ring of the wall, and a band of niches built into the masonry above the bench, and it is entered by stairways at the north and the south through antechambers set close to the cardinal line. The orientation is deliberate, as the orientation of so much in the canyon is deliberate, the chamber squared and aligned not by chance but by intention to the directions and to the movements of the sky, and the labor of digging and walling and roofing. So great a room speaks of gatherings that drew people in from across the basin. In the long rear rooms of Pueblo Bonito were laid a small number of the dead, and with a few of them was gathered a wealth in ornament found with almost no one else in the whole of the Puebloan world. Thousands of beads and pendants of turquoise and shell heaped about the bodies, whole vessels and inlaid ornaments and staffs of office set with them, and these rooms were kept and returned to across many generations. The burials added to and tended long after the first of them were laid, so that a single chamber held the honored dead of a line across 2 centuries and more. The study of those bodies has shown them related each to the next along the mother's line, a single kindred kept apart in death from all the rest, which speaks of standing and descent and the holding of place across the long life of the canyon. On the side of Fajada Butte, high near the summit behind 3 heavy slabs of fallen stone leaning against the cliff, a spiral was pecked into the rock face, set so that at midday near the turning points of the year, a narrow band of sunlight falls between the slabs and crosses the carved spiral, a single bright dagger of light passing through its center at the high summer standing of the sun and falling in pairs to either side at the winter standing, marking the solstices against the stone. And the alignments are not confined to the butte, for the great buildings themselves were laid to the meridian, and to the rising and the setting of the solstice sun, the long straight wall of Pueblo Bonito, dividing the building along the line of north and south, and some among the great houses and the great kivas set to the farthest limits of the moon's long, slow cycle of nearly 19 years, the standstills of the moon that only the patient watching of many years can find. The niches set into the wall of Casa Rinconada above the bench, some of them found sealed with the small offerings of beads and turquoise laid into them when the chamber was built, speak of the dedication of the place and of the care with which it was raised, and the great floor vaults, which may have held the drums or the sounding boards of the gatherings, lay to either side of the central fire, where the gathered people sat upon the ring of the bench in the dim light, let down through the roof. Out across the basin, the watching of the sun was carried on from shrine-like features set on the heights, low arcs and circles of stone gathered at the ends of roads and on the rims, places that looked to have served the marking of the horizon and the turning of the year and the ceremony that attended it, so that the keeping of the calendar was not the work of the canyon alone, but reached out along the roads to the far houses. The offerings left through the canyon, the deposits of whole and broken pottery, the caches of turquoise and of ornament, the careful sealing of rooms and of doorways, all speak of a place where the marking of the sky and the honoring of the dead and the gathering of the living were bound together, where the building and the ceremony were one work. In the wall of Pueblo Bonito, a doorway was set in the corner of a room so that the light of the rising sun at the winter solstice passes through it and falls upon the opposite wall, a small and deliberate marking of the year's lowest turning built into the daily fabric of the great house, one of several such alignments that bind the building to the sun. The great kivas, with their deep sunken floors and their benched walls and their roofs raised on great posts, seem to have been made with an attention to sound as well as to sight. The enclosed circular space gathering and holding the voices and the drums of the gatherings, and the floor vaults to either side of the fire may have served that gathering of sound, so that the chamber was an instrument for the ear as well as an instrument for the eye. The offerings placed through the building, the beads set into the post holes beneath the great roof posts before they were raised, the turquoise and the shell sealed into the niches of the walls, the careful deposits laid in the floors, all speak of a place dedicated and consecrated in its making, where the raising of a wall or the setting of a post was itself an act of ceremony. So the masonry itself became an instrument set against the sky, and the keeping of the year, the marking of when the sun stood still and turned back, and when the moon reached the limit of its long wandering, was built into the walls and the kivas and the lone pecked spiral on the height above the canyon's mouth, and the watching of the heavens was woven through the whole fabric of the place. The year in the canyon turned on water and on cold, and the whole of the life there was fitted closely to its turning. The maize that fed the population could not depend on the rain alone in a place that received so little of it, and so the runoff was gathered and led taken from the slick rock and the bare stone above where the summer storms shed their water in sudden sheets, caught by low diversion dams at the mouths of the side canyons, held in catchment basins, and led down by canals and head gates, and spread across the planting ground through gridded earthen borders that held the water on the plots long enough for it to soak down to the roots. It was a careful and a deliberate farming, a working of the brief and violent water of the desert by holding and spreading what would otherwise have run off and cut the ground, and it asked the constant attention of the people across the warm half of the year. The planting followed the last hard frost of the spring. The seed set deep in the warming soil to reach the moisture held below, several seeds to a hill, and the hills spaced wide, and through the early summer the fields were tended and weeded and watched, while the air grew hot and the wash lay dry and the storms had not yet come, and the stored grain of the winter ran low. Then in the late summer the storms built over the basin in the heavy afternoons and broke over the canyon, brief and violent and local, one drainage flooding while the next stayed dry, and the same water that the maize needed cut at the floor of the wash and deepened the arroyo year by year, giving and taking in the same hour, so that the farming was always a working at the edge of what the land would bear. The harvest came in before the autumn frost. The maize dried on the cob and shelled, and carried up into the high storerooms of the great houses and the small rooms of the unit pueblos, the beans and the dried squash and the piñon of the good years stored beside it. And on that gathered store, the canyon lived through the winter, when the basin lay under snow and hard frost, and nothing grew in the frozen ground, and the wash lay still. The cold of that season was long, and the days were short, and the sun stood low and weak in the southern sky, and the work of the warm months gave way to the indoor work, the grinding and the weaving and the making, and to the keeping of the fires through the long nights, until the sun climbed slowly back from its lowest standing, and the light returned, and the year turned again toward the spring and the breaking of the ground. The water that the farming turned upon was not only the runoff of the side canyons, but the moisture held in the deeper sand of the dunes along the southern side of the floor, where the maize could be planted to reach what the winter snows and the summer storms had laid down below the surface. And the people read the land closely for where that moisture gathered and set their plots accordingly, spreading their farming across the floor and up the tributary drainages so that the failure of one place might be met by the yield of another. The risk was constant, and it was understood, for the same year that flooded one field left the next dry, and a late frost in the spring or an early one in the autumn could take the crop in a night, and a summer whose storms held off could empty the storerooms before the next harvest came. And so the gathering and the keeping of the surplus of the good years against the lean ones was as much a part of the farming as the planting itself, and the great houses with their many storerooms stood at the center of that keeping. The labor of the year moved in its long round, the breaking and planting of the spring, the tending and watching of the early summer, the gathering of the late summer storms and the harvest of the autumn, the indoor work and the fires of the winter, each season with its own tasks and its own weight. And the people of the canyon lived that round across their lives as their forebears had lived it. Beyond the planted fields, the seasons brought their own gatherings from the wider land, the piñon trees bearing their rich nuts heavily in some autumns and not at all in others, so that the good massed years were seasons of gathering and storing the oily seeds against the winter, and the hunting moved with the year as well, the deer taken in their seasons on the mesas, and the rabbits driven and snared on the flats, the wild plants gathered as each came ripe through the warm months. The gathering of fuel was itself a labor that grew harder with the years, for the burning of wood for warmth and cooking, and the firing of pottery drew steadily upon the piñon and juniper of the country around, and the nearer stands were cut, and the gatherers ranged farther out across the seasons to bring the wood back to the canyon. The frost-free window in which the maize could ripen was short and its edges uncertain, a late spring frost or an early autumn one able to take the crop, and the people read the lengthening and shortening of the days and the standing of the sun closely to set the planting and to know how the season ran. And the turning points of all of it, the standing of the sun at the two solstices and the long swing of the moon across its years, were the very things the buildings and the kivas and the pecked stones were set to mark, so that the calendar written in the masonry and the calendar lived in the fields were one and the same. The watched sky telling the canyon when the deep cold would break, and when the rains might be looked for, and when the seed should go into the warming ground, the heavens and the harvest bound together in a single round. Through the early part of the 12th century, the building in the canyon slowed, and then very nearly ceased, and the long surge of construction that had raised the great houses across 300 years came to its quiet end. After about the year 1130, a drought settled over the basin, recorded plainly in the rings of the trees, which narrowed and held narrow across decades, and in a land that had always lived close to the margin of its water, the failure of the rains across so many years pressed hard upon the maize and upon the gathered runoff and upon the stored grain that carried the canyon through its winters. The careful farming that had held the place together depended on water that no longer came in its old measure, and the gathering of people and goods that the great houses had drawn inward from across the basin could not be sustained when the basin itself was failing. Over the following decades, the great houses of the canyon were used less and then emptied, and the center of the Chacoan world moved north toward the San Juan and the Animas rivers, where the water was surer, where new great houses raised at Aztec and at Salmon and at other places took up the same banded masonry and the same stepped rooms and the same sunken kivas, and carried the old pattern forward into better watered ground for a few generations more. There was no single ending in the canyon, and no layer of burning or ruin laid across it, no sudden emptying, nor any sign of a calamity that fell in a season, but rather a slow withdrawal across the long years. The rooms closed one by one as the households left, some of the doorways carefully sealed with masonry from within, some of the great roof beams drawn out whole and carried away to be set again in buildings elsewhere. The fields left unworked and the canals untended, and the wash allowed at last to take its own course down the floor. By the 13th century, the canyon held only a small and scattered occupation, the great houses standing quiet and open along the cliff, with the wind moving through their empty rooms, and the people who had built them and kept them had gathered into the descendant communities that became in time the Pueblos along the Rio Grande, and the people of Zuni and the people of Hopi on their high mesas, and the canyon and its building entered also into the world, and the memory of the Diné who came to live in the country around it. The strain upon the canyon had been gathering for some time before the great drought of the middle century came, for an earlier dry spell late in the 11th century had already pressed upon the basin, and the very success of the canyon, the drawing of so many people and so much building and so great a demand for timber and for maize into one dry place, had pressed hard upon the land around it. The nearer forests cut and the soils worked, and the margin grown thinner with the years. When the long drought set in upon all of this, the gathering could no longer hold, and the reorganization that followed carried the Chacoan pattern north to the surer rivers for a time, where the great houses at Aztec rose with their own road and their own alignments, and their own great kiva, the canyon's order continued in a new place, even as the old center fell quiet. In the generations after, the people of the wider region drew together into the large cliff villages and the aggregated towns of the 13th century before those two were left, and the long movement carried the descendant communities at last to the mesas and the river valleys where their towns stand to this day. The withdrawal from the canyon was part of a wider movement that unsettled the whole of the region across the following century and more, as the communities that had spread across the high tableland drew together and shifted and drew together again, until in the late 13th century a long and severe drought across the wider country emptied even the great cliff villages to the north and west, and set the descendant peoples on the final stages of the migrations that brought them to the places where their towns now stand. The houses at Aztec on the Animas, raised in the canyon's pattern and serving as a northern center after Chaco grew quiet, themselves held a few generations of that ordered life. With their own great kiva rebuilt and roofed and their own enclosing structures, before they too were left, the long Chacoan way fading by stages rather than ending in a single season. Through all of it, the canyon was held in memory, never a place wholly emptied of meaning, for the descendant peoples carried it in their accounts of where they had come from and how they had moved, and returned to the country around it, so that the stone left standing along the cliff remained a known place and a remembered one across the centuries. The place was never truly forgotten by those whose ancestors had raised it, for it lived on in the oral histories and the clan accounts of the Pueblo peoples, who hold the canyon as a place of their own deep beginning and their migrations, so that what came to the canyon was not an ending and not a vanishing, but a leaving, the slow movement of a people away from a center that the changing land could no longer feed, carrying with them the memory of the stone they left behind. The great houses stand today as roofless masonry along the base of the northern cliff, their walls held up across more than 8 centuries by the same dryness that once made the canyon so hard to live in, preserved in places to 3 and 4 stories, where in a wetter country such buildings of earth and stone would long since have melted back into the ground. They lie now within Chaco Culture National Historical Park, reached only by a long, unpaved road that turns off the highway and runs for many miles across the basin, rough and slow and often washed by the same storms that watered the old fields. And that road keeps the numbers low and the canyon quiet, so that a person walking the floor among the great houses finds much the same silence and the same wide light that held the place before. The banded stone of the finest walls is still there to be read, the broad courses set off by their bands of thin tablets just as the masons laid them, and the doorways step through the thick walls from room to inner room as they always did, the T-shaped openings among them, and the round kivas lie open now to the sky that their roofs once closed against the weather, the benches and the niches and the ventilator shafts and the floor pits all plain in the falling light. The long straight segments of the roads are legible still on the ground and clearer yet from the air, holding their old courses across the mesa tops toward the houses far out in the basin, and the cut stairways still climb the cliffs where the roads met the rock. From the surviving beams, the tree ring record has fixed the building of the great houses to single years and in places to single seasons, so that the raising of a wall can be dated as closely as a thing 800 years gone can be dated at all. And the same dry, clear air that holds the stone has left the canyon one of the darkest skies that remain in the wide country. The same deep field of stars against which the masons once set their walls to the meridian and the solstice and the standstill of the moon. The descendant communities hold the canyon still as a place of their origins, and walk its floor and keep its memory in the old accounts. The canyon has been studied for well over a century, since the early excavations at Pueblo Bonito at the turn of the 20th century opened the great rear rooms in their burials, and through the careful work of later expeditions that mapped the masonry and read the beams, and through the long survey of the latter part of the century that traced the roads across the basin and set the great houses within their wider world. It was the patient work of recent decades that recovered the road system from the air and the ground, that rid the solstice marking on Fajada Butte and the lunar alignments of the buildings, and that traced the timber and the pottery and the turquoise to their distant sources, so that the reach of the canyon is now understood far better than the walls alone could show. The place is held today as a national park and as a site honored across the world, watched over with the descendant communities whose ancestors raised it and who return to it still, and its remoteness and its dark sky are kept as part of what it is, the preservation of the soft stone against the weather and the years and unending labor. The canyon is held today as a place of deep meaning to many descendant communities, the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, and the Hopi on their mesas, and the people of Zuni and Acoma and the others, more than a score of affiliated tribes, together with the Diné, whose country surrounds it, and the keeping of the place is done now in consultation with them, the stone of their ancestors tended with their counsel. The preservation of the great houses is an unending labor, for the soft sandstone and the mud mortar that endured so long in the dry air are worn even so by the rain and the frost and the slow settling of the walls, and the work of stabilizing them goes on quietly, season by season, so that what stands may go on standing. The remoteness that keeps the canyon quiet has also kept its sky dark, and the place is honored for that darkness as much as for its stone. The deep field of stars overhead, drawing those who would see a sky as it was before the cities lit the night, the same sky against which the great houses were squared. Through the long round of the year, the light still falls at the solstices upon the marked stones, and through the aligned doorways, as the builders set it to fall, the turning of the sun kept now by the watching of those who come to see it. The site is still there, and the city is not, and along the northern wall, the banded stone stands as it was laid, the round rooms open to the light, the roads running straight out into the basin, and the alignments that the builders fixed against the turning sky still holding true, season upon season, in the long quiet of the canyon at dusk.